You know that moment when you realize your entire life has become a performance? I was sitting in my Tesla outside a Whole Foods in Beverly Hills, engine off, air conditioning humming, watching people walk by through tinted windows. 3.2 million followers. Brand deals worth more than most people's houses. A verification checkmark that supposedly meant I mattered. But I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked me in the eyes and asked how I was really doing. The notification sounds were constant. Ding, ding, ding. Comments, likes, shares, mentions. Each one a tiny hit of dopamine that lasted maybe 3 seconds before I needed another fix. I'd built this incredible machine of validation, and somewhere along the way, it had started eating me alive. That morning, I'd woken up in my Malibu apartment to 17 missed calls from my manager. Some brand wanted me to promote their energy drink. Another collaboration request. Another opportunity to smile at a camera and pretend that carbonated sugar water had changed my life. The script was always the same: enthusiasm, authenticity, connection. Except none of it felt real anymore. I used to love making videos. Back when I had 300 followers and filmed in my childhood bedroom, I'd spend hours editing because I genuinely cared about every frame. I wanted to make people laugh, to share something meaningful, to create a tiny moment of joy in someone's day. Now I had a team for that. Editors, writers, thumbnail designers. They'd optimize the soul right out of my content. The woman walking past my car was maybe 60, carrying groceries, talking animatedly on her phone. Probably to her daughter, or her sister, or her best friend from college. A real conversation with someone who knew her before she was anybody special. When was the last time I'd had one of those? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Hundreds of names. Managers, agents, fellow creators, brand representatives. But who could I call just to talk? Who knew me as more than a follower count and an engagement rate? The loneliness hit me like a physical weight. Here I was, supposedly connected to millions of people, and I felt more isolated than I had as an awkward teenager. At least then, my 3 real friends actually knew my middle name, my biggest fears, what made me cry during movies. That's when I made the decision. I needed to disappear. Not forever, not dramatically, but just long enough to remember who I used to be before the cameras started rolling, before every moment became content, before I turned my entire existence into a brand. I needed to find out if there was still a real person underneath all the performance. And honestly, I was terrified of what I might discover. What if there was nothing left? What if I'd become so good at being what everyone else wanted that I'd forgotten how to just be myself? The plan started forming as I sat there. One night. Just one night as nobody special. No ring light, no perfect angles, no carefully crafted persona. Just me, whoever that was anymore, in a world that didn't know my name or care about my content. I turned the key in the ignition, and for the first time in months, I drove somewhere without filming it for my story. The thrift store in Pasadena smelled like old books and forgotten dreams. I'd driven 40 minutes to get there, specifically choosing somewhere I'd never been recognized. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I wandered through racks of clothes that had lived entire lifetimes before ending up here. A gray hoodie caught my eye. Soft cotton, worn thin at the elbows, with a faded logo I didn't recognize. When I held it up, I realized it was probably older than some of my followers. There was something beautiful about that. This piece of clothing had existed in the world, had been loved, had kept someone warm through countless ordinary days, all without a single person documenting it online. The fitting room mirror was unforgiving. No ring light, no perfect angle, no filter to smooth out the exhaustion I'd been carrying for months. Just me, fluorescent lit and real. I pulled on the hoodie and barely recognized myself. For 3 years, every outfit had been calculated. Colors that popped on camera, brands that aligned with my image, styles that would photograph well. This hoodie did none of that. It just felt like coming home. The jeans were next. Genuine wear patterns from someone else's life. A small paint stain on the left knee. A tiny hole near the back pocket. Imperfections that told stories I'd never know. In my world, imperfections were edited out, photoshopped away, hidden behind carefully curated perfection. But these flaws felt honest in a way that made my chest tight. The baseball cap was the final piece. Navy blue, sun-faded, with a bent brim that spoke of actual use rather than aesthetic choice. I tucked my hair underneath and looked in the mirror again. The person staring back could have been anyone. A college student, a weekend artist, someone's son visiting home, someone completely, beautifully ordinary. Walking to the counter, I caught myself checking my phone automatically. A habit so ingrained I didn't even realize I was doing it. 47 notifications in the 20 minutes I'd been shopping. Comments on my morning post, DMs from brands, mentions from other creators. A digital avalanche that never stopped. I turned the phone face down and left it in my pocket. The cashier was maybe 19, with purple streaks in her hair and a name tag that read, Sage. She looked at me the way cashiers look at everyone. Not trying to place my face, not wondering if I was someone important. Just a person buying clothes from another person. The transaction was beautifully mundane. "These are great finds," she said, folding the hoodie with practiced efficiency. "Especially this one. Someone really loved it." "How can you tell?" "The way it's worn. See how it's softer here?" She pointed to the chest area. "That's from being hugged a lot. Good clothes hold on to love like that." Something about her words hit me unexpectedly hard. When was the last time I'd been hugged? Really hugged. Not the performative embraces at industry events or the quick side hugs for photo ops. A real hug. The kind that lasted long enough to actually feel another person's heartbeat. I paid in cash. Another small rebellion against my documented life. No credit card trail, no receipt to photograph, no story to post about thrifting finds. Just an exchange of money for clothes, the way humans had been doing it for centuries. Back in my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The clothes smelled like fabric softener and possibility. I'd spent thousands on designer pieces that made me feel like I was wearing a costume. These $20 items felt more like me than anything in my walk-in closet. The fake glasses were my final stop. A costume shop in a strip mall, the kind of place that probably hadn't updated its inventory since the 90s. The glasses were simple, black-rimmed, with clear lenses that would hide the recognition that sometimes flickered in people's eyes when they almost placed my face. Driving toward downtown LA, I caught glimpses of myself in the rearview mirror. Each glance was startling. I looked like someone who took the bus to work, who worried about rent, who had normal problems and normal joys. Someone who existed in the world, instead of floating above it in a bubble of artificial relevance. The warehouse district was a maze of converted spaces and forgotten corners. Perfect for disappearing. As I parked and walked toward the gallery, my heart hammered against my ribs. Not from excitement, but from pure terror. What if I was boring without my platform? What if the real me, stripped of followers and fame, had nothing interesting to say? What if I'd been performing for so long that I'd forgotten how to just be human? The gallery's entrance was unmarked, just a heavy door and the sound of voices drifting from inside. I stood there for a full minute, hand on the handle, wondering if I was making a massive mistake. But the alternative was going home to my empty apartment and my empty life, surrounded by all the markers of success that felt increasingly hollow. I opened the door and stepped into the unknown. The warehouse hummed with something I'd forgotten existed. Real energy. Not the manufactured excitement of a brand launch or the calculated chaos of a content house party. This was organic, unfiltered, alive. People moved through the space like they belonged to themselves, not to their phones. I kept my head down at first, overwhelmed by the strangeness of being anonymous. No one turned when I walked by. No whispered conversations about whether I was who they thought I was. No phones subtly angled in my direction. I was just another person in a gray hoodie, and the relief was so intense it made my knees weak. The art covered every surface. Paintings that looked like they'd been torn from someone's dreams. Sculptures made from discarded city fragments. Photographs that captured moments too honest for Instagram. I found myself actually looking at the pieces instead of thinking about how they'd photograph. When was the last time I'd consumed art without considering its content potential? That's when I saw it. A canvas maybe 3 feet wide, dominated by swirling blues and grays that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. It was like staring into deep water, the kind that holds secrets and sorrows and truths too heavy for shallow spaces. The longer I looked, the more I felt like I was drowning and being saved simultaneously. "It gets you, doesn't it?" The voice came from behind me, warm and unpracticed. Not the polished tone of someone used to being recorded, but the natural cadence of genuine conversation. I turned to find a woman maybe my age, paint still smudged on her fingers, hair escaping from a messy bun in ways that suggested function over form. Her eyes were the first thing that struck me. They looked directly at me, not through me or around me, but at me. When was the last time someone had really seen me? Not my brand, not my image, not my potential value to their own aspirations. Just me, standing in a thrift store hoodie, trying to remember who I used to be. "Yeah," I managed, my voice rusty from disuse and genuine conversation. It's like it knows something I've forgotten. She smiled, and it transformed her entire face. Not the practiced smile I'd perfected for cameras, but something spontaneous and real. That's exactly what I was hoping for. I call it drowning in plain sight. It's about feeling invisible even when everyone's watching. The words hit me like a physical blow. She'd just described my entire existence in 6 words. How could a stranger, someone who knew nothing about my life or my struggles, capture exactly what I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate? You painted this? The question came out more vulnerable than I'd intended. Guilty as charged. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving new paint streaks. I'm Maya, by the way, and you look like someone who understands what it means to feel lost in plain sight. Maya. Not a username, not a handle, not a brand. Just a name that belonged to a real person who created real things with her actual hands. I realized I'd been holding my breath. I paused. For 3 years, introducing myself had been automatic. My name followed immediately by my platform, my follower count, my latest project. But standing here, looking at this woman who'd somehow painted my soul, those words felt like lies. I'm Jake, I said finally. Just Jake. Not Jake with 3.2 million followers. Not Jake the influencer. Not Jake the brand. Just a person with a name. Well, Jake, what do you think happens to people who stay underwater too long? The question caught me off guard. I looked back at the painting, at the figure suspended in those blue-gray depths. They forget how to breathe air? Or, Maya said softly, they discover they were never meant to live on the surface. We stood in comfortable silence, both staring at the canvas. Around us, the gallery buzzed with conversations about technique and meaning and the price of authenticity in a commercial world. But in our small bubble, there was just the painting and the strange recognition that passed between 2 people who'd found something true in a space designed for pretending. Can I ask you something? Maya turned to face me fully, and I felt exposed in the best possible way. What made you come here tonight? You don't look like the usual gallery crowd. I almost laughed. If only she knew how far outside any usual crowd I'd traveled to get here. I needed to remember what it felt like to be nobody special. The honesty surprised us both. I'd meant to give some generic answer about supporting local art, but something about Maya's directness had stripped away my usual deflections. And how's that working out for you? Terrifying, I admitted. Turns out I'm not sure who I am when no one's watching. Maya nodded like this made perfect sense. That's the thing about drowning in plain sight. Everyone assumes you're fine because you're still moving. But movement isn't the same as living. She gestured toward her painting. I spent 2 years working on this piece. 2 years trying to capture what it feels like to be surrounded by people who see you, but don't really see you. To be known by everyone and understood by no one. I wanted to tell her about the millions of people who followed my every move, but knew nothing about my middle name or my childhood fears. About the brand partnerships that paid my bills but left my soul bankrupt. About the verification checkmark that was supposed to prove I mattered, but only made me feel more like a product than a person. Instead, I just nodded and said, "You nailed it. If this story is hitting you in the feels, smash that subscribe button because what happens next will blow your mind. And drop a comment telling me about a time when you felt invisible. Let's build a real community here." 3 hours. That's how long we talked, and I didn't check my phone once. When you're used to measuring time in engagement metrics and posting schedules, 3 hours of uninterrupted conversation feels like stepping into another dimension. Maya had this way of asking questions that peeled back layers I didn't even know I'd built up. We'd moved from her painting to a quiet corner where mismatched chairs surrounded a small table covered in art books. The gallery buzzed around us, but we might as well have been on our own planet. Maya tucked one leg under herself and leaned forward like she was genuinely interested in whatever I might say next. When was the last time someone had given me that kind of attention without wanting something in return? "So, what makes you feel most alive?" she asked, absently sketching on a napkin while we talked. Her hands never stopped moving, always creating something, even in casual conversation. The question should have been simple. I'd built an entire career around appearing vibrant and engaged. But sitting there, looking into her expectant eyes, I realized I didn't have an answer. Not a real one. "I used to love making videos," I said finally, the words feeling rusty. Not for anyone else, just for the joy of creating something that might make someone smile. I'd spend hours editing these silly little stories, trying to get the timing just right on a joke, or finding the perfect song to match a mood. "Used to?" Maya's pencil paused on the napkin. That's when it hit me. The exact moment I could pinpoint when everything changed. "Yeah, Used to. The admission felt like swallowing glass. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the joy and started being about the numbers. Views, likes, shares, comments. The algorithm became my master instead of my tool. Maya nodded like she understood completely, even though she couldn't possibly know the specific hell of chasing viral content. I went through something similar with my teaching. Started measuring my worth by test scores instead of whether I was actually reaching the kids. Took me 2 years to remember that education isn't about data points. You're a teacher? This surprised me. She seemed too free, too unstructured for the rigid world of education. High school art. Day job that feeds my soul job. She gestured around the gallery. These kids, they're so afraid of being imperfect that they've forgotten how to be authentic. Sound familiar? It sounded like my entire generation. We'd grown up performing our lives for invisible audiences, curating our existence for maximum appeal. But Maya was different. Even now, talking to a stranger in a warehouse gallery, she was completely herself. No performance, no agenda, no angle. What happened to that joy you used to feel? She asked, returning to her sketch. When you were making those videos just for the love of it? I had to think about that. Really think. I guess I convinced myself that reaching more people was more important than reaching them authentically. That impact was measured in scale rather than depth. I traded connection for reach and somehow lost both. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I'd expected. Maya looked up from her napkin, and I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen in years. Not pity, not judgment, but genuine compassion. The kind that comes from recognizing your own struggles in someone else's story. You know what's funny? She said, adding a few more lines to whatever she was drawing. The pieces I create just for myself, the ones I never plan to show anyone, those are always the ones that end up meaning the most to other people. It's like authenticity has its own magnetic field. I thought about my most popular video from 2 years ago. It wasn't a sponsored post or a carefully planned production. It was me, exhausted after a 14-hour day, talking directly to my phone about feeling overwhelmed. No script, no perfect lighting, no editing. Just raw honesty. It had gotten more genuine engagement than anything I'd posted before or since. I think I'd been so busy trying to be what everyone else wanted that I forgot how to want anything for myself, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. Maya finished her sketch and slid the napkin across the table. It was me, but not the me from my profile pictures or professional headshots. This was me as I sat there in that moment. Hoodie wrinkled, fake glasses slightly crooked, but with something in my eyes that looked like hope. Sometimes we have to get completely lost to remember who we really are, she said softly. The trick is being brave enough to stay lost long enough to find something real. Around us, the gallery was starting to thin out. People were saying their goodbyes, making plans to meet for coffee, exchanging numbers without immediately following each other on social media. It was like watching an alien species, these humans who connected without documenting every interaction. I should probably head out, Maya said, but she didn't move to leave. Early morning with the kids tomorrow. But this has been... She paused, searching for the right word. Real. Thank you for that. Real. Such a simple word. But it hit me like a revelation. When was the last time someone had described an interaction with me as real? Everything in my world was curated, optimized, branded. But this conversation, this connection, this moment of genuine human contact, was the most real thing I'd experienced in years. As Maya gathered her things, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small canvas, maybe 4 by 6 inches. It was a painting of a figure removing a mask, but underneath wasn't another face. It was a galaxy of stars, infinite and beautiful and mysterious. For remembering, she said, pressing it into my hands. I drove home through empty LA streets with Maya's painting balanced carefully on my passenger seat. And for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt full of possibility, of questions I'd forgotten to ask myself, of a conversation that had reminded me what it felt like to be seen rather than simply watched. The painting caught streetlight as I drove, the galaxy of stars seeming to shift and pulse with each passing lamp. Maya had painted something I couldn't articulate, but desperately needed to understand. Who was I underneath all the performance? What remained when you stripped away the followers, the brand deals, the carefully constructed online persona? My Malibu apartment felt like a museum when I walked in. Everything perfectly placed, optimized for the occasional story or background shot. The couch positioned for ideal lighting. The books arranged by color rather than content. The kitchen that looked beautiful, but rarely saw actual cooking. I'd created a space designed to be photographed, rather than lived in. I set Maya's painting on my nightstand and stared at it for a long time. The figure removing the mask looked peaceful, not afraid of what they might find underneath. When had I become so terrified of my own authenticity? Sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about Maya's question. What made me feel most alive? The answer had been buried under years of algorithmic thinking, of content calendars, and engagement strategies. But lying there in the dark, I remembered. I remembered the video I'd made in my childhood bedroom about my grandmother's recipe for chocolate chip cookies. Not because it would go viral, but because I missed her and wanted to honor her memory. I remembered the series I'd done about small businesses in my hometown, spending hours interviewing shop owners not for views, but because their stories mattered. I remembered when creating content felt like leaving pieces of my soul in the world, rather than feeding pieces of myself to an insatiable machine. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I woke up without immediately checking my phone. Instead, I sat on my balcony with coffee and watched the sunrise paint the Pacific in shades Maya would have appreciated. No camera, no story, no documentation. Just me and the morning, and the strange sensation of existing without proving it. When I finally picked up my phone, the notifications were overwhelming as always. But instead of the usual dopamine hit, I felt something closer to nausea. Hundreds of people demanding my attention, my validation, my performance. When had my life become a 24-hour show with no intermission? That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I opened my camera app, but not to create content. I needed to create truth. No ring light, no perfect angle, no script. Just me in that same gray hoodie from the night before, sitting in natural light, talking to my phone like it was a friend instead of a judge. I've been thinking about masks, I began, and the words came easier than they had in months. Not the kind we wear for Halloween, but the ones we put on every day. The versions of ourselves we present to the world because we think that's what people want to see. I talked about feeling lost in plain sight, about the loneliness of being known by millions but understood by none, about the difference between being watched and being seen, about a conversation with a stranger that had reminded me who I used to be before I became a brand. The video was 8 minutes long. In my world, that was an eternity. Attention spans were measured in seconds, not minutes. But I posted it anyway, raw and unedited and real. The response was unlike anything I'd experienced. Not because it went viral, though it did, but because of what people shared in the comments. Thousands of stories about feeling invisible, about losing themselves in the pursuit of external validation, about craving real connection in a digital world that rewarded performance over authenticity. I thought I was the only one who felt this way, wrote one comment that had over 1,000 likes. Thank you for being brave enough to say what we're all thinking. Another. This is the first time I've watched one of your videos and felt like I was talking to a real person instead of a commercial. And another. I've been following you for 2 years, but this is the first time I actually see you. Maya had given me more than a painting that night. She'd given me permission to be human again, to create from a place of truth rather than strategy, to remember that behind every screen, every profile, every perfectly curated feed, there was a real person craving real connection. The video changed my trajectory completely. Brands that had been courting me suddenly went quiet, uncomfortable with this new direction toward authenticity. My engagement rates fluctuated wildly as the algorithm struggled to categorize content that didn't fit neat marketing boxes. Some followers left, confused by this departure from my usual content. But something better happened. I started attracting people who cared about the same things I did. Real stories, genuine connection, the courage to be imperfect in a world obsessed with polish. My comment sections became spaces for actual conversation rather than performative praise. 6 months later, I realized Maya had been right about drowning in plain sight. I had been underwater for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. But sometimes you have to nearly drown to remember how precious air really is. 6 months later, I found myself standing outside that same coffee shop in Pasadena where I'd bought the gray hoodie, holding my phone with Maya's contact information on the screen. I'd spent weeks tracking her down through the gallery, through mutual connections, through the kind of detective work that felt both necessary and terrifying. I needed to thank her. More than that, I needed her to know that our conversation had saved something in me I didn't even realize was dying. She arrived exactly on time, paint still under her fingernails, wearing a sundress that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than cameras. When she saw me, her face lit up with genuine recognition, Not the calculated excitement of someone meeting a content creator, but the warm surprise of running into an old friend. "Jake," she said, and hearing my name without any qualifiers attached felt like coming home. "You look different." I was different. The months since our gallery encounter had been a complete reconstruction of everything I thought I knew about success, purpose, and what it meant to matter. "I wanted to thank you," I said as we settled into a corner table. That night changed everything. Maya stirred honey into her tea, the same unhurried way she'd moved through the gallery. "You started making art again," she said simply. "Real art. The kind that matters." She was right. I'd begun creating content that fed souls instead of algorithms. Stories about people like the 70-year-old man who'd started learning piano after his wife died. Not because it would go viral, but because his journey reminded me that it's never too late to find new ways to express love. Videos about the teenager who'd started a community garden in a food desert. Not for the views, but because her story deserved to be told. My metrics had become irrelevant. Engagement rates, reach statistics, conversion percentages, all the numbers that had once defined my worth felt like measurements from another lifetime. Instead, I measured success in the messages from people who said my content had helped them feel less alone, had inspired them to pursue something meaningful, had reminded them that authenticity was more valuable than approval. "The funny thing is," I told Maya, "I lost followers but gained something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" "Myself." Maya smiled, the same unguarded expression that had first caught my attention. "You know what I love about teaching teenagers? They haven't fully learned to perform yet. Sometimes they'll create something so honest it takes your breath away, just because they haven't figured out how to lie with their art." I thought about my recent content, how it felt like returning to that teenage honesty. Raw, imperfect, real. "I've been thinking about that painting you gave me," I said. "The person removing the mask to reveal stars. I used to think the mask was protection, but it was actually a prison." "The scariest part about taking off a mask," Maya said, "is not knowing what you'll find underneath. But the most beautiful part is discovering you were never meant to hide." Around us, the coffee shop hummed with ordinary life. Students studying, friends catching up, people existing without documenting every moment. It was the kind of scene I'd learned to appreciate again. The beauty of unperformed humanity. "Can I tell you something?" Maya leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've been following your content since that night. Not because of who you were online, but because of who you became." The admission surprised me. "You knew who I was?" "I figured it out eventually. But here's the thing, Jake. That night in the gallery, you weren't an influencer, or a brand, or a verification checkmark. You were just a person who needed to remember how to be human. That's who I was talking to, and that's who I've been watching grow ever since." Her words hit me with unexpected force. All those months I'd worried about losing my audience, about sacrificing reach for authenticity, about whether anyone would care about the real me. But Maya had seen the real me first, before she knew anything about my platform or my numbers, and she'd chosen to stay connected to that person. "That painting on your nightstand," she continued. "It's not about removing masks to become someone else. It's about removing them to remember who you always were." I pulled out my phone, not to check notifications or post a story, but to show Maya something. It was a photo of her painting, still sitting on my nightstand, but now surrounded by other authentic things. Books I actually read, photos of real moments with real friends, a journal where I wrote thoughts that would never become content. "It reminds me every morning that being real is more valuable than being perfect," I said. Maya's eyes softened. "You know what the best part is? You're not just creating authentic content now. You're creating space for other people to be authentic too. Your comment sections have become places where people share real stories, real struggles, real hope. You've built a community around truth instead of performance." She was right. My platform had transformed from a highlight reel into a gathering place for people who were tired of pretending. We talked about failure and fear, and the courage it takes to be vulnerable in a world that rewards polish over honesty. This is more than just my story. It's a movement. If you believe that authenticity matters more than algorithms, that connection trumps clout, then subscribe and join our community. Hit that like button if Maya's message resonated with you. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their worth isn't measured in followers. And comment below. What mask are you ready to take off? Together, we're not just creating content. We're creating a space where being real is more valuable than being perfect. Welcome to the family.